Welcome everyone to Impact Talks podcast from SIMA Rama. This month we have a documentary that is extremely relevant, super important to the global conversation, the national conversation, no matter where you are. And it's one that's near and dear to me. It's called Salam Neighbor. This month's film, Salam Neighbor, is put together by filmmakers Temple and Zach Ingrasci, who are with us today. Both of them actually got to experience full-on moving into the Za'atari refugee camp that is based in Jordan and is home to over 80,000 Syrian refugees who have been displaced by the war. And so I'm really excited to look forward to talk to you guys. Also with us today is Qutaiba from the Global Policy Institute. So I'd love for everyone to introduce themselves. But before that, last but not least, we also have Alessandria Masi, who's joining us by phone, and you can see her awesome cat in her photo, which I think is just awesome. So Chris and Zach, why don't you start us off and tell us a little bit about you guys?
Yeah, so my name's Chris, and this is my co-director and producer, Zach. Sorry, we have an ambulance going by. But alongside ourselves who directed the piece, we also have two incredible producers, Salam Neighbor and Mohab Katab, who are Mohab's based in Bahrain. And they've actually from the very beginning helped bring another perspective to the film, and really what you see on screen of Arabs and Americans coming together is what happened behind the camera as well, of Arabs and Americans coming together to create this film.
Yeah, and really in 2013, the inspiration for this film came from Salam Neighbor, who's the daughter of Palestinian refugees. It was a really conversation with her. We were actually on tour with our last film and had this kind of moment in a coffee shop, and just hearing her story of what it means to be forced to flee your country, what it means to have to restart your life in a country where you don't even have the same rights, totally surprised and shocked us, and kind of opened us up to the experience of refugees, and really inspired this piece. And together, this team, half American, half Arab, really collaborated to create what is Salam Neighbor.
I really love that you highlighted the half Arab, half American, just because I feel like oftentimes when we talk about the concept of refugees, it's like this other because they speak a different language, they're from a different ethnicity, and we feel the need that we can't connect. And especially when you have folks who are both, like myself, who are both Arab and American, and to see that being reflected on the screen, I think is super powerful. So we'll go into the effects of that in a little bit. But Alessandria, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I am the managing editor of Syria Deeply, a Syria-focused news platform, and also the managing editor of our new sister platform, Peacebuilding Deeply. And the cat's name is Cecilia.
Well, we are happy that both you and Cecilia are here with us. And then last but not least, Qutaiba.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Qutaiba Idlbi. I'm still Syrian, born and raised in Syria. Left Syria after the revolution in 2011 and ended up here in the United States in 2013. Technically, I think I'm a refugee, but I didn't walk hundreds of miles, or I didn't have to stay in a refugee camp, so I'm not really. But yeah, I'm a researcher at the Global Policy Institute focusing on refugee issues and economic development in the Middle East, and I'm a full-time student at Columbia University.
Amazing. So we have tons and tons to talk about. And I want to start off by picking up on the last point that Chris and Zach were discussing. And so we were saying a little bit earlier, the mass perception of refugees is not a pleasant one, to be quite frank, especially when you're looking at it from a Western's perspective. Things get lumped into concepts under mass immigration and people trying to take over, or people trying to take advantage of the system. And so characters in human stories like the ones you all captured are completely lost. So how did you do that? Why was it important for you to give folks their identities back as humans and break away from these big, scary concepts that people are used to hearing in the mainstream media?
Yeah, and I mean, diving back when we first started diving into this project, it was in 2013. Really, there wasn't even much coverage of the Syrian refugee crisis at the time. Of course, things changed dramatically, and at that time, we were really seeing most of the focus on the war and the violence. And when we even, kind of proposed this to our friends or family, they were just shocked that we would even consider going to the Middle East or shooting this film, and were really worried for us. And we've done crazy other projects and, living in extreme poverty, other stuff that you would think would be more shocking. And you could just see there's so much fear around this issue. And, already the Syrian refugee crisis was the largest largest refugee crisis since World War II. So it was really relevant, but it wasn't being talked about. There was so much fear, and there's clearly these monologues coming from all different directions and very little dialogue. And so really the core of this piece was creating that dialogue. And in the film, my favorite moment is when we're sitting in the camp on our last day. We had spent this incredible experience with our friends there, and they ask us, do you see us as we see ourselves portrayed on the news, as violent, as terrorists? And after that experience, of course not. But for so many of our friends and family, that was the reality. And so leaving that experience in this camp, we were so able to relate to our friends there on so many different levels and bring that forward in the film.
I mean, I think at its core, we all fear what we don't know, right? And I think that that's a core problem that we're seeing across all of the Western world right now, is that somebody who's never met a refugee will fear a refugee. But if we can try to break down those barriers, and you can get to develop a relationship with somebody, you'll see this perspective in an entirely different way, and recognize actually a lot of what research has shown, especially around Syria, is how how much Syrian refugees are adding to the economies that they're going into, whether that's in Jordan or across Europe. And so it's been really kind of a mind shift for us, and it's something that since we've done 900 plus screenings with Salam Neighbor and a lot of different kind of impact campaign work around the film to really try to shift that narrative and dialogue.
And one of the questions I have, I think even just for the panelists, like I'm quite, I'm kind of a big fanboy of Syria Deeply. That's literally how we were doing our research when, there wasn't really amazing information coming out about the refugee crisis way back in 2013, 2014. But when our film released, even though we've been working on it for so long, it released right around the time that Aylan Kurdi, washed ashore in Turkey. And there's this huge outpouring of sympathy, but it wasn't necessarily empathy. And our film was trying to kind of get at a deeper level of seeing our refugee neighbors as humans like ourselves. And I just, it's interesting to see the different points in the refugee crisis that awareness was happening, and I, just if it was positive or negative, like how did Aylan Kurdi shift the narrative, and was, it's kind of an interesting thing that we continue to explore as this film, continues to go in different directions. It hit Netflix or do different things. It's kind of been interesting to see the narrative around refugees change and adapt.
Right. And then I guess measuring the impact, right? So I think for that time that you mentioned with Aylan Kurdi, everyone was outraged. But then where did that outrage go? And I think that's the question that we consistently want to ask ourselves. So I, as a reporter at the Huffington Post, I followed a Syrian refugee family for a year from when they were settled into the US and kind of how they were processing. And so in the beginning of the resettlement process, you had many media outlets who wanted to interview different families, and it was usually 1-2 stories, and they didn't quite follow them for a very long period of time. And oftentimes journalists were saying, well, the outrage is gone, right? That news peg for that time being is gone. And that's frustrating that people don't have the patience or want to continuously be outraged. So Alessandria, yes, I want to bring it to you. As I was mentioning, how do we not just capitalize on that moment, but make it a continuous process for a publication like Syria Deeply to cover it when people are paying attention, are not paying attention? And how do we tell that story with integrity so it's more than just tugging at people's emotions?
That's a great question, and I'm glad that we're bringing this up. It's something I see all the time. So I'm Canadian. I live in Lebanon, but I'm Canadian. So when I come home, so many times my friends, my family will be like, well, there's all of these young, healthy Syrian men coming in. Why do they want to come to Lebanon, to Canada? Sorry. And as someone who covers this, I see it all the time. I don't know any young, healthy Syrian men coming to Canada. It's mothers and children. that's who's coming in, and there's nothing wrong with either group, but it's just their perception is so skewed. And I think when that photo came out, it did help them see, I guess, how hard it was for people to get there. That they weren't making a personal choice. They don't want to come to Canada on a vacation. It's not like they look at a globe and are like, yeah, that looks fun. It's not an option for most of them. So that helps. But covering Syria, we have these kind of like bursts, right? So he was one of them. Then we had Omran, the little boy in the ambulance, whose picture was on the front of every newspaper after a barrel bomb strike. There was the chemical attacks, the US strike on Syria, the fall of Aleppo. Those really in the last 2-3 years have been the only bursts of Syria. And then people forget. And I think there's so much noise around it. If you look at the way Syria was covered at the beginning, the issue we were all fighting against was that it wasn't being covered, right? It wasn't on CNN. Nobody knew, nobody was talking about it. And now I think we might have gone too far in the other direction in some points. There's too much noise. There's not enough information. If something big happens, I get Google alerts for Syria on my phone. And so you can see it happen in real time. There's 20 stories, and they all have different headlines all about the same issue. And if you're done just reading the headlines and you're not invested in Syria, you're not going to try and understand this because it doesn't make sense. So, I mean, there are 3 things I try to remind myself when I do this and when I do Syria deeply, and it's don't give up, don't give in, and don't play God. It's not up to us to make any kind of grand proclamations about what one missile strike is going to mean for 2 million people. It's not up to us to predict what's going to happen in a year, because if you cover Syria enough, you'll learn that you have no way of knowing. It doesn't matter how much you know, who you talk to. You could wake up and something is going to blow your mind because you never expected it to happen. Yeah. So I think that's the way to do it with integrity, is just don't give in to the noise. Don't forget about Syria, but don't give in to all of the noise. There's no need to be first just to make this grand statement about Trump and Putin on Syria, when tomorrow the story is going to be completely different anyway.
Yeah, that's an absolutely good point. Qutaiba, I want to bring you in. As someone who is a native Syrian, forgetting about Syria is not really an option. I can imagine. So how do you balance that with your research, and what do you think the world needs to understand when it comes to the conflict? Because there are so many factors, like Alessandria was saying, people want to focus on the Trump angle or the Putin angle, and getting lost in the politics of it all. When we need to bring it down to a human level, what do you suggest?
Thank you. I mean, at the beginning, being engaged, with being Syrian and being engaged, sometimes it's not really a choice. You can't just get out of the reality that you need to help your people, you need to stay connected. It's not only friends, it's not only a sense of community, but friends and family are still there. And those communities that are, that needs help are, not just people who you share an identity that you might not have chosen, but it's also, relatives in blood and people you shared, life experience with. So it's, at some point, it's not really, I think time ago after I left Syria, it wasn't really a choice to stay engaged or not. But I think what is most important usually, and I want to echo on what Alessandra said, we usually get lost with those bursts, that come out of Syria. And especially that, we focus like, oh, this is a huge thing coming up. What shall we do as human beings? And honestly, as individuals, sometimes there's little that we can do to really change, those big events. Because what should have happened, in an ideal situation, if a burst comes out, it's the responsibility of our leaders basically to take that and then build a policy to stop what's going on. But what has been happening is that our leaders basically were just, putting bandages over what is happening, dealing with those bursts, and not basically dealing with the main situation that is going on the ground, because no one basically was willing to invest. Our responsibility as individuals starts with basically pushing our leaders and telling them that we're aware of what's going on. This is not a matter of, dealing just with the refugee symptoms or with the stories of the barrel bombing symptom. has been a lot going on, I mean, in the past 7 years, and we need to deal with the core of the issue. The only misconception that we always have is that we always, when we get engaged with such events, we want to change the world. We want to make everything better just in one day. And in reality, the best we can do is just to change maybe someone's life. Just do a small thing and then we move on. It's then the responsibility of the people around us, of other people, to take that and move on. And Salam Neighbor, I mean, I think exactly did that. I mean, I don't think it was anyone's responsibility, for example, to put a documentary explaining everything that has been happening in Syria in those 4 years when Salam came out. But it was good enough, just, I mean, to focus on the story of Raouf, on the story of Ismail, on the story of Ghussoon. Each single story of, of those individuals tells you a lot about what is happening. The passion that the trauma that Raouf went through, basically, and his inability to go back to school, Ismail's future that has turned around and basically stopped at the point when he entered the refugee camp. Ghussoon's story that is still going on, that we don't know if she's still getting aid or not, if her dream of staying out of the camp is still going or not, because the aid stopped and she might have returned to the camp, or she might even got the worst and might have been forced to go back to Syria. So it's always important just to focus on the small achievements that we can do, on the small changes that we can change on people's life, and then push our leaders, our politicians that basically we elect to do the big work, to change the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought in so many good points. The one I kind of want to focus on, Chris and Zach, he was talking a little bit about like these small accomplishments and taking these small things and using those as pivotal moments. I want to ask you all if there were, other than producing this film, or if there were small accomplishments or just small moments that kind of really hit you during this experience that made you think differently of the crisis, made you learn something about yourself. Chris, I think you had quite the special relationship with Raouf. I mean, it had me as a viewer emotional, seeing you emotional, and just thinking of like all the kids like him. What were some of those small accomplishments for you guys?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about that Raouf moment first. In the film, we've been really encouraging Raouf to get back into school. He'd been out of school for 2-3 years, and to us, the simple solution was to help get this kid back in the classroom. And I think what ended up happening when he went to school that day, he literally crumpled in the doorway of the classroom and couldn't cross that threshold back. And it was such a reality check in that moment that when you set out to help somebody, the first step is to truly understand the circumstances of where they're coming from. And I think so many of us, like we were saying earlier, have these good intentions when we see a photo of Aylin Kurdi or Omran, but if we don't truly understand the best way to help, sometimes you can actually have a negative impact with your outreach. And so for us, kind of that was a big lesson and takeaway coming out of this, was to take the time to get to know and learn about the circumstances of a kid like Raouf, and then help them get back in. And on the positive side, talking about these little wins, we were actually able to help connect Raouf with Ismail, who is another friend of ours in the camp, who's been tutoring him, and through the centers, actually the Save the Children trauma centers in the camp, helped Raouf get over some of the issues he'd been dealing with, to work through some of that healing through play, through art. And we're actually thankful to say he's back in school now, and hopefully kind of keeping that dream of his alive to become a doctor. And we can speak actually very frequently via WhatsApp and Facebook, where everybody in the camp has a cell phone, and you can, one of his favorites is to just send selfies back and forth like any 13-year-old kid at this point.
Which has really connected, and I think my connection maybe was strongest with Ismail, who looked a lot like my dad. Like literally, if you put photos next to what you see in the film, like they looked very similar at the same age. And yeah. I just kind of immediately connected. He wanted to be a teacher, he was really well spoken. We had a lot in common, and for me, that relationship didn't stop after the month that we were there. It's continued to go on, and it's been a really interesting experience because he's done so much in the camp. He's a big part of the community. But from the very beginning, he was like, my life is on pause. Like, I really have to get out of here. And I will, and kind of what you were saying, Alessandra, he's like, I just have to go anywhere that's not here. And it's not, and we have some good news that he's actually being resettled to Canada. He arrives in Antigonish on the 13th after being in the camp for almost 5 years now. Canada has a really incredible program where a community can sponsor a refugee. But it wasn't that he wanted to go to Canada. It's that he literally wanted to go anywhere. And we were like, okay, you have this opportunity in Antigonish. It's really, really cold. And he was like, oh, I don't care. My whole family has this opportunity. I want to go and restart my life and hopefully study and kind of take his life back. So for us, this has become, almost a now a 4-year journey with him. It's really been tough because of how long that process of resettlement is, and just, it's kind of like winning the lottery, but winning the lottery over like a 4-year period of time, or winning the lottery then not getting the money for 4 years, I guess, is another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
But it's been really interesting. So for me, it's this like long-term relationship we've been able to develop with him, and continuing to follow that story. We're continuing to film with him when he arrives on the 13th. So we're excited to see where he takes that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, I guess, when you said winning the lottery or this ideas of opportunity, it was also so amazing to see that they had built their little ecosystem, the different refugee families in Za'atari, showing this perseverance and this willingness to not seek, like you said, just sympathy or pity, because that's not the point, but not only just empathy, but for there to be real, tangible, I think, solutions. So Qutaiba, I want to bring it back to you. How do when Syrians, whether they're in Za'atari or whether they get opportunities to go to a place like Canada or go elsewhere, how are they looking for these opportunities to essentially start a brand new life from scratch? What does that look like?
I mean, it's very complicated. I remember the first time I got to the US, it took me several months to decide whether to stay or not. So there's always this hesitation to adopt the new environment or not, because a lot of people, when they think about refugees, they compare them to immigrants. And the situation is totally different, because when you immigrate, you made the choice basically to leave and go to that country that you want to go to. In the case of refuge, you don't really make the choice when you have to leave home and leave your, not only your life, even, the single details, your pictures, your clothes, everything. When you leave all of these behind, you're kind of you don't feel that you're in control. So even when you get the resettlement process is not something that I choose to build a new life and leave Syria behind. I left Syria in 2011. I went to Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, but specifically in the Middle East, it was hard for me to stay there because I felt that the situation that I was forced to leave, the oppression, specifically oppression, lack of freedoms, it still existed in those different countries. So for me, as Syrian who was seeking freedom with the revolution, it was really hard to adapt to the new situation. Because even as Syrians, we were kind of overlooked. There was nothing. I mean, even if you some people criticize local governments, but we were still overlooked. But you can basically look and see how local communities live, and they have all the right basically to kind of be a little bit maybe bothered by Syrians. But you look at the local communities and their sufferings, and you see, you ask, you wonder, what is the point? Why is this happening here as well? And why me as basically Syrian who wanted, you realize that what you wanted in the past couple of years, it's not only your problem, but it's a regional problem. But then, coming and moving to a different country, it's kind of to look for this environment where we can just be ourselves, where we can, express who we are, walk down the street, not, having the fear to look back, at our backs and see if someone is following us, or like it's the meaning. I mean, the meaning of it, can really be symbolized in me here talking to you, not being afraid that, someone is gonna walk in right now and arrest me, or that I will have to use like a secured VPN and I have to change my, my voice or not show my face. It's like, those are small things. But at the same time, it's also a beginning of a new journey to think, when are we going to go back? What are the skills that we can learn here to take back and work on our communities when we would have the chance to go back?
Alessandria, I want to pose you the question, how do we bridge the disconnect between the experiences that refugees are going through, experiences that are similar to Qutaiba is going through, that disconnect that he was talking about, and then what's happening when it comes to like the mainstream coverage? What makes it so difficult for folks to understand? Why do you think there's such a barrier? And then how do we respond to that?
I think the barrier comes from fear, and we spoke about this earlier. Someone brought it up, which is the fear of someone coming in and doing something bad to you. It's not. I think really it comes down to that. I don't think people are inherently bad. That's why, it doesn't come from being bad people. There's not one population that's better than the other. It comes down to fear, and part of that comes from the language that's used in reporting or in anything that talks about these issues. If you describe the refugee crisis as large swaths of refugees going anywhere, large swaths, it's not something that is going to make you feel comfortable, right? And that's just one example of language that's being used to separate the two groups and make people more afraid on both sides. Because of course, if you have a population that doesn't want to welcome you, you don't want to go. You feel concerned for yourself as well. So yeah, language is definitely one thing. The other thing is, it's hard to do with the news because the news is often bad. It focuses on the bad stories. There are good stories. As you said, if you meet someone and you develop a relationship with them, like in the movie, of course you will completely change your outlook on things. But not everybody has that process. There are a few organizations doing things to change that. There's a few where they've organized Skype calls between 12-year-old in a refugee camp in Lebanon and somebody in the US, a kid in the US, so they can just talk. As a reporter, I think all you can do is keep telling the stories. Keep telling the stories of people's lives as long as they want to tell them, and hope that people will read it and will understand, and that it might overpower the large swaths story. And we do that at Syria Deeply, and there have been a few instances where I've seen an impact. I've seen, we had a diary writer who would just write from Damascus every week, and she wrote one story about what she had to go through to sublet an apartment as a single woman in Damascus. And it was nothing to do with the war. It just had to do with subletting an apartment, which is annoying and difficult for everyone. And there were women in, Minnesota messaging Syria Deeply and from all corners of the world being like, wow, that was eye-opening. She's just like us. And I think the more we can do that, we'll chip away at it slowly. But, war happens really fast. But changing minds and progress and making people understand, that's slow. We can't expect it to happen as fast.
In terms of creating impact, and so if you have someone who is reading these stories on Syria Deeply or has seen the film Salam Neighbor, and they are either touched or outraged or feel the need to participate in some sort of call to action. This is a question I want to pose to everyone since you all have such different experiences. Let's start off with Chris and Zach. What is your advice? What are your suggestions? Someone is upset, someone is motivated, someone is feeling all the different feelings. What can they do wherever they are? How can someone help?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different ways to get involved in different levels. I'll start with probably the one that I've seen the most effective is really something that we had no idea before starting this journey and thinking about the impact, is that there are so many resettlement agencies throughout the United States, throughout Canada. There are so many opportunities to literally interact and support and, you know, become friends with people who have gone through these experiences. The IRC has a lot of offices and opportunities to get involved and volunteer. I'm from Seattle. A lot of my closest friends saw the film and then started volunteering with the IRC, especially if you have hard skills like, you know, you're a physical therapist, for example. Like, you know, one of my close other moms kind of got involved in it, and it's been now a number of years that she's been involved. It wasn't just a one-time thing, and she had no idea that her skill set of being a physical therapist could be so useful for people literally coming from war zones. And so that volunteer option, even though it's kind of the big kahuna and takes a lot of time, is actually so needed. And, you know, especially now that there's so much less funding coming from the Trump administration for refugee resettlement. A lot of these offices are on the brink of closing. It's a kind of dire times for the resettlement community. And so that's kind of a great way to get involved at a much deeper level, a way that I actually had no idea was kind of at most communities' fingertips. And there's resettlement groups all around the United States. If you go to salamneighbor.org and take action, there's a map that you literally can just type in your area code and find an organization that you can volunteer with.
Qutaiba, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key is to find something small and sustainable. We always, going back to the burst, when those happens, usually we have this energy to do something big. But I mean, like by the time the bursts go, we're just focused on something else. So I think it's just really the key is to find that sustainable thing that we can, like, you know, just if we can give a small amount of our time and focus on, but it will keep, the focus is to keep our relationship with the conflict or with the cause that we're working on, that it's not only, you know, 2 weeks or 3 weeks and then we move on. And there are different ways to do that, but I think a key thing is to stay engaged, is to keep ourselves, to keep our knowledge about what's going on, about the cause itself. So we would always be encouraged to do the work that we're doing. Like for us, for example, as Syrians, it's the stories we hear from relatives. It's, you know, what always keeps us going. But for people around the world, I mean, like there are a lot of initiatives. I'm on the board of an amazing organization called Paper Airplanes, where it does we do one-on-one English tutoring over Skype for displaced, for refugees and displaced populations. And the key to the to Paper Airplanes, for example, is not only like teaching the language skills, but making that connection between individuals who are going through that suffering and people here in the US or around Europe or around the world, so they can hear the stories and know firsthand basically what's going on. For example, I mean, I encourage everyone who wants to commit, for example, to go to Paper Airplanes website. We provide curriculum and we do some training for it. Like, you don't need to have an experience to do the tutoring online. And we give all guidance needed for that. So you only need to have the to know how to speak English, basically, and have, you know, 2 hours a week to, you know, to talk with someone basically in the region who have been through that, learn from them about their experience, and give them something that would help them get along. But yeah, the main thing is basically engage in something sustainable.
And then Alessandria, when it comes to reading things online, because there can be a lot of disinformation out there when it comes to Syria, and I think some people can also get overwhelmed, like what they were saying. People want to learn about the conflict, and you have so many factors going into it. You have the human element, you have the political element. Where do you suggest someone starts?
Syria deeply.
We're just going to end it at that, because I don't think you could promote anything else. No, I think that's an excellent point. And to add to what everyone was saying, I think showing up is also extremely important. And people sometimes are afraid to commit to large products, like you were saying, Qutaiba, starting with something that's small and sustainable is super important. Not everyone has to move to a refugee camp or go to Za'atari like Chris and Zach have, but they have done it for us. And so people can hopefully learn something within that experience without actually going through the hardships that actual refugees go through, or what these two fellows went through. And so I think that's important. And showing up, I think we underestimate those small things. I remember when I was reporting out, when I was following this Syrian family, they had resettled over to New Jersey. And so after each interview, you know, I would call and text and be like, okay, you know, is there anything that you need, food, aid, like what's going on? And so that maybe I couldn't do it, but I could kind of provide off to someone else. And I've done that for a while. And then after they were dismissing me and like not answering, because people start to notice that refugees are very humbling people and don't just take handouts to begin with. But I was kind of pushing this family and I was just like, why aren't you, you know, accepting this aid? And she was just like, honestly, the fact that you just check in on like a weekly basis, like is the world and back. And it hit me in such a powerful way. Of a simple text message would mean so much. And then I realized that having a sense of community, having a sense of someone is checking up on you on a regular basis, whether that's sending a selfie like Raouf, or having diaries being sent out to Alessandria through Syria Deeply, having that mode of communication, I think people want to know that they're not forgotten, in addition to not being feared. And so I feel like that was an important theme of this film, and I was super grateful for it as a viewer, and I hope everyone that watches it gets the same sense. But I wanted to just give a minute for if anyone has any lasting thoughts that they feel the urgency to pipe up that I maybe didn't ask.
Sure. Actually, if I could, just more than Syria Deeply, of course, I think we don't have to overcomplicate it. People have, if you are outraged about something you've read about Syria, there's something very simple without commitment that you could do, which is just tell your friends, tell the people you love. That's how we're going to change the narrative. People have this power that they're not aware of, which is to spread the word. And I think that's more powerful than anything else that will bring about lasting change. And if you want to start learning about it and you haven't, and it seems very daunting and complex and loud, ask anyone. People will answer because they want to talk about it and they want you to understand. And that really takes no commitment on your part.
Absolutely. I think just going in with an open mind may seem like a small ask, but it makes the world of the difference. So thank you all so much for telling each of your stories, bringing your expertise, and joining us in this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I hope you all have too, and for everyone else that watches this in a bit later. And Chris and Zach, why don't you sign us off with where can folks go online if they want to read more, learn more?
Yeah, so anybody can come to our website, salamneighbor.org, or also go to the SIMA.org website to learn more about the film. We definitely encourage you guys to one, watch it, and then two, like we were talking about here, get involved. We have a page on our website where you can get involved. You can go to Syria Deeply. You can go to Paper Planes, Qutaiba's website, and actually Skype and help. And just leaving you on a last personal note, you know, the work that Paper Planes is doing, that type of tutoring has been so big for Ismail, who's getting resettled just next week. And he's been learning English for the last 2 years while in the camp via Skype. And now he can, when he arrives in the community, actually have that leg up and start integrating right away and getting his life, you know, pressing the play button again. So, you know, don't underestimate what your little actions can do. And thank you guys for that part of it.
Thanks. It's great.
Yeah, smallest things have the biggest impact. And I think that's a great way to end.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much.
Great.
Thank you all. Have a good one.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Have a good one.